duffel bag. It was dark, but she said she could identify him. The eyewitness's critical identification of Charles Ng gave investigators probable cause to issue an arrest warrant. Clara Lynn Balaz, Leonard Lake's ex-wife, was questioned about her ex-husband's association with Charles Ng. She agreed to talk, but only after her attorney convinced the district attorney's office to grant her immunity from prosecution. Balaz claimed she didn't know anything about the murders. She did tell them that after the shoplifting incident, Ng walked to her house.
What kind of trouble are you in?
The two drove back to the lumberyard to see if Lake was all right.
Well,
when they saw him talking to the police, they returned to her house. There they waited, expecting a call from Lake, who was now in police custody. When he didn't call, Clara Lynn drove Ng to his apartment. Ng told Clara Lynn he had to get out of town.
She said that she thought he would probably go to Chicago, that he had mentioned that he would go to Chicago if he had to get out of town, and she claims that that was the last that she saw of him.
Because Ng was wanted for murder and there was reason to believe he had fled the state, the California investigators asked for assistance from the FBI. In response, the Bureau launched a massive manhunt for Charles Ng. At San Francisco International Airport, agents learned that a passenger fitting Ng's description had boarded a plane to Chicago, traveling under the name Mike Kimoto. In Chicago, agents worked to track Ng's movements. They started with an extensive background check. Investigators learned that Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong and entered the United States on a student visa in 1979. He enlisted in the Marine Corps, but was eventually arrested for stealing weapons. He escaped from prison and, on the advice of a friend, hid out with Leonard Lake and his wife Clara Lynn. Ng stayed with Lake and his wife for 6 months in Philo, California. At the same time, ATF agents were building a case against Lake for possession of illegal firearms. In the spring of 1981, they arrested both Lake and Ng. Lake skipped bail and began his life as a fugitive. Ng was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence.
Ng was released from prison in 1984 and immediately came back to the San Francisco Bay Area, was picked up at the airport by Clara Lynn Balaz, and rejoined his buddy Leonard Lake.
Charles Ng was an experienced fugitive with a wide network of friends who could help him. To develop more leads, the FBI placed Ng on their 10 most wanted list. For the time being, agents focused on Ng's friends and acquaintances in the Chicago area. As the investigation into Charles Ng expanded, the body count in Calaveras County continued to climb. Not far from Lake's cabin, investigators unearthed 2 intact bodies wrapped in sleeping bags. Calaveras County Coroner Terry Parker was on the scene.
They were mostly skeletal remains that were wrapped. You couldn't really make out if they were men or women because of the time that the bodies had been there.
Due to the deterioration of the bodies, Parker could make only a cursory examination at the site. It appeared both victims had been gagged and handcuffed. He asked for help from the San Francisco Medical Examiner.
San Francisco has a very good forensic department, and he was more than happy to come up and assist us. We removed the bodies and transported them to his office for the forensic work where that was done.
At autopsy, the San Francisco medical examiner determined both victims were males and that they had been shot to death. Using dental records, he identified the men as Lake's neighbors, Lonnie Bond and Scott Stapley. In Chicago, the FBI got their first lead.
You know why we've arrested you today?
They learned that after serving time on the weapons charge, Ng had kept in touch with his former cellmate. A man described how he had driven Ng first to Detroit, then to the border town of Chatham. There, he said, they split up. A witness came forward and told agents that he had seen Ng board a bus in Chatham, bound for Toronto. Agents were aware that Ng's sister lived there. The FBI deployed a surveillance team at her apartment house, but the fugitive never showed. After days of following Ng, the trail grew cold. A suspected serial killer was now roaming free in Canada. As word of the multiple murders spread, the news media descended on the property in Calaveras County. Don Lasseter is a true crime author who wrote a book on the Charles Ng case.
And of course, the media, when they first heard of this, rushed to the site, and daily the media coverage grew, and it got coverage all over California, and soon all over the United States, and certainly even in Canada.
All right.
Okay, Ron.
The investigators agreed to let the media on the property. They showed them the site and allowed them to videotape some of the evidence they had collected.
Up until this point, we've really relied on our imaginations to visualize this story. But today we have pictures that will probably leave many people with an everlasting image of the horror that occurred at the end of this road. These are some of the bone fragments that have been found, and investigators say there are countless fragments just like those scattered over 1/3 of an acre here. The California Conservation Corps has been recruited to pick up the bones. Most of them worked on their hands and knees, raking the ground with their fingers. Investigators came up with 10 pounds of bones. The local coroner says 5 bodies have been found here so far. The Calaveras County Sheriff once told me, though, he believes there are as many as 20 victims, though, buried on the property.
Investigators were counting on the media exposure to help identify the 21 women depicted in the photographs tacked to the wall of Lake's bunker.
We certainly want to know the circumstances of the photos, when they were taken. We're interested in knowing anything we can about Mr. Lake and Mr. Ng.
A telephone hotline was set up by the Calaveras Sheriff's Department, and calls soon began pouring in. Detectives believed Leonard Lake and Charles Ng crossed paths with as many as 25 people who were later reported missing.
Property in Calaveras County.
Working under San Francisco investigator Ed Erdelatz, the task force tried to piece together any leads that would locate Ng or help identify the growing list of victims.
Anybody that had anything to do with either Lake or Ng, we attempted to identify and find out if they were still alive, and if they were, what their relationship was. And it was through that process that we began to identify different victims.
Members of the task force were sent around with photos of personal belongings found on the property in an effort to identify anyone who had been at the cabin. Relatives and friends of the missing realized their loved ones might be among the dead. There was the Dubs family from San Francisco, who placed an ad in the newspaper to rent their video equipment and were never heard from again. Randy Jacobson, a friend of Leonard Lake's, was found buried near a chicken coop behind the cabin. Jeff Gerald, who worked with Ng at a San Francisco moving company, disappeared along with his friend Clifford Paranto, who worked at the same company. Ng's longtime friend Mike Carroll and his girlfriend Kathleen Allen had disappeared. Lake's neighbors were also missing. Lonnie Bond, Brenda O'Connor,